Hi guys, welcome to Kaizen View. Today in this video we'll talk about project procurement and how to do that in 10 easy steps. So let's dive in straight. Procurement basically means to buy something, to shop for a service or a product. On a fundamental level, you need to understand whether procurement is needed, what you need to procure, how much to procure, and when to procure. Let's take an example. If you have to get your home painted, do you need to have a painter come to your house and paint it, or you can do it yourself? So basically that answers the question whether the procurement is needed. And to paint the house, you will need paints, brushes, and of course the painter. So that is the what to procure. And how much of the quantity of paint you would require will answer the question how much to procure. And when do you need to paint it? Do you need to paint it on weekends when you have more time on your disposal? That answers the question when to procure. So that is a basic example. Let's go into the step-by-step methods to procure. Step 1 is create SOW. SOW means scope of work. So before you start with the process of procurement, you need to define your scope. So how many rooms you have to paint, what kind of paint you require, how much time you have to paint. Similarly, in a project terms, you can define this by giving the drawings of the project to the contractor, by giving the specifications of what you need to get it done, and by telling them your contract conditions. So overall, the drawings, the BOQ, the conditions of the contract will define your scope of work. That will help the contractor, the vendor who has to do the work. In a basic terminology, you can call it the seller. And you are the buyer, you're buying the services of the seller. So the seller will sell the paint job or any kind of work to you, and you pay the price to him for that service. So you need to have a defined scope which will have the drawings, the BOQ. The BOQ is bill of quantities, which will define the quantities of the work to be done. For example, if you have to get a wall built, the BOQ will exactly tell what kind of wall is required, whether it's a block wall or a brick wall or a concrete wall, and what is the length of the wall, the height of the wall, the width of the wall. So that is, all this information is given in the bill of quantities, or in other words, specifications. So these elements, the drawings, the BOQ, the conditions of contract, will define your scope of work. Step 2 is to create a cost estimate, which is also called budget in technical terms. So to understand this, let's take an example again of the painting job. You have to get your home painted, and you have some X amount of money in your pocket, but you don't know how much the paint job will cost you. If the paint job costs less than what you have in your pocket, what you have in your budget, it's great. But if it costs more than that, you will have problems paying the vendor for the services they offered. So the idea is to calculate an estimate of the work before you start with procurement. So you calculate the quantities of the work, multiply with the prevailing rates, and you get the amount that defines the amount which you will be spending on the work. You get a fair idea how much that work will cost you, and then that will also help in evaluating the tenders when you get it, and how much is the ballpark figure before you can award the works. Now you move on to step 3, which is identifying the qualified sellers, which also can be called technically as setting the bid criteria. This is important to have the competent persons, the competent vendors for getting your job done. Now how you do this? You check for the past experience. It could be your past experience with the vendor, you have worked with them in the past, or it could be their past experience where they have delivered similar projects successfully for other clients. The next is reference checks. You can ask your vendor to supply the list of references on his past work, and then you can personally check them to your satisfaction. Another important aspect is the turnover of the contractor. The turnover is important because there should be sufficient amount of cash flow available with the vendor so that he can work on a project seamlessly without just depending on your monies. The next is safety checks. In construction, safety is of paramount importance. You have to check for contractor safety record. Now you have the scope of work, you have the budget with you, you have the list of the vendors you want to float the tender. The next step is to how to reach your contractors or vendors or the concerned parties who will be doing your work. There could be 3 or 4 different ways in which this could be done. If it's a public project and you want to seek public bids, the best way to do is through newspapers or advertising on your company website. Generally in a private company, the tendering is shared with the list of the vendors you shortlisted. So email is the best medium to float the tender. This process is called IFB, which is called invitation for bids, which is same as tendering. Now is the time to share your tender set with the vendors. This process is also called issuing RFP or issuing RFQ. RFP stands for request for proposal and RFQ stands for request for quote. Both means the same, so you are asking the contractor or vendor for their cost proposal as per your scope of work. This RFP document, this should have certain prerequisites, certain defined parameters such as conditions of contract, which will define the nature of the work, the exact location of the work, the timeline of the work, any work compensation if that has been preordained, what are the bonds insurances which are required, if there is any penalty clause or if there is any reward clause. All this can be the part of the conditions of contract. So once you share requirements, you set a date in your RFP document by which you have to get your proposals back from the vendors or contractors. And once you get them, this process is called responding to the RFP, responding to the RFQ, which is done by the seller. So the vendor will be sharing their acceptance on the conditions of the contract. They'll share the costing. They will share any deviation from the specifications you mentioned in the RFP document. So once you receive the proposals, the next step is to evaluate them, review them, analyze them, and do a techno-commercial evaluation of your proposal, which means analyzing them technically, whether it's as per your specifications or not, and analyzing them commercially as well to understand whether it fits your budget or not, or are there any deviations from your desired specifications or scope of work. It's time to shortlist the top 3 or 4 bidders which suits your work profile. The criteria for this is generally the lowest bidder is given the first priority simply because it will save a lot of money. You also evaluate which is the most technical sound bid which suits your specification. You also check what is the time frame the vendor has proposed for doing the work, whether it suits your timeline. Of course, past experience is also checked when you shortlist top 3-4 bidders. Once you come up with top 3, top 4 vendors, so you have to bargain for the best price and product. So that is where negotiation kicks in. Generally, there are 3 rounds of negotiation. So there are different methods to negotiate. Either you negotiate on the total cost or you can also negotiate on the item-wise cost for different items. So once you finalize who you want to work with, you sign the deal, you issue LOI to the vendor, which is letter of intent, which is a simple basic document which says that you intend to work with the vendor on that particular work. It could be an email format or it could be a simple letter. It's different from a contract. A contract is a legal document, LOI is not a legal document. So the first step is to give the LOI to the vendor and the second step is to give the contract. Generally, contract will take time, minimum 10 to 15 days, because there are several legal aspects to the contract which needs to be finalized before both the parties can sign the contract. Alright, so you're done with the procurement, you have the vendor on board, you're going to start the work. So once you're done with the work, it is very important to close the contract. The contract closure is also a part of procurement, and it is important that both the parties sign off after the contract closure to ascertain that the work has been completed satisfactorily as per the conditions of the contract, as per the scope of the work defined. And as a buyer, you need to issue a certificate of contract closure to the seller, so there are no further legal disputes later after the work has been done. And as a good project manager, it's your responsibility to archive all the procurement documentation and save it for any issues developing later. Thanks guys, that is a simple definition of procurement. If you have questions or comments, please comment in the comment section, and if you like the video, please share your like. Thanks for watching.